Before we begin, I have a question for you. Where are you watching from? Are you in a big city or a quiet little town? Comment below and let me know, because this story, it can happen anywhere. This isn't just another tale of betrayal. It's the kind of raw, painful, and vicious story that changes lives forever. I was a husband, a father, a man who believed in loyalty. I worked hard, built a future, and trusted the people I loved. But one night, I discovered something that shattered my entire world. My wife wasn't just cheating on me. She was cheating on me with my own brother. They thought they had won. They thought I would be too broken to fight back. They thought I was weak. They were wrong. Because when I take a hit, I don't just get back up. I take everything. And when I was done with them, they had nothing left. I met Candace 10 years ago, in one of those bars where people go to drown their regrets. She was beautiful, confident, fiery, the kind of woman who made men forget themselves. And when she looked at me, it felt like I was the only man in the world. We got married fast. Too fast, maybe. But back then, I thought love was enough. I built a life for us. A home. A future. We had 2 sons, Nathan and Lucas, my whole world. I worked long hours running my private security firm, ensuring rich, powerful people stayed safe. My job was about spotting danger before it happened. Ironic, isn't it? Because the biggest threat to my life wasn't a stranger. It was the woman sleeping next to me every night. Looking back, the signs were right in front of me. Candace started going out more. She said it was just girls' nights or gym sessions, but she never cared about fitness before. Her phone never left her hand. She became distant, distracted, different. And my brother Nick? He started acting weird too. He would cancel plans last minute, avoid family gatherings, make excuses that never made sense. But I was blind. I trusted them, both completely. Until the night that changed everything. It was supposed to be a normal business trip. I had flown out of town for a security training session, something routine. But at the last minute, the deal got postponed. So instead of staying overnight, I took the last flight home, thinking I'd surprise Candace. The real surprise was waiting for me inside my own house. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed something off. Nick's car was parked down the street, half hidden in the shadows. For a second, my brain tried to find a logical explanation. But then I saw it, the dim glow of our bedroom light. And in that moment, I just knew. My entire body went cold. I walked inside. The house was quiet, too quiet. Then I heard it, a low moan, a breathless laugh, a whisper. I climbed the stairs slowly, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. And when I pushed open the bedroom door, there they were, my wife, my brother, together, in my bed. Nick saw me first. His smug grin vanished, his entire body tensing like a trapped animal. Candace? She froze. Then she did something that made my stomach turn. She smiled. It wasn't happiness. It was relief, as if she had been waiting for this moment. Jason, she said breathlessly, pulling the sheets around her. I can explain. Explain? Explain what? That she had been sneaking around with my brother? That she had destroyed our family for a cheap thrill? Nick scrambled up, throwing on his clothes. Look, man, this doesn't have to be a big deal. I stared at him, barely hearing the words. Something inside me snapped. But I didn't scream. I didn't punch him. I just smiled. Get out, I said quietly. Nick hesitated, like he wanted to argue. Then he saw the look in my eyes, and bolted. Candace stayed frozen in place, watching me with wide, panicked eyes. What are you going to do? She whispered. I grabbed my bag. Watch. And with that, I walked out. Because I wasn't done with him yet. Not even close. I walked out of that house, without looking back. Not because I was running away. Not because I was weak. But because I knew that revenge is best served cold. The night air felt sharp against my skin, but I barely noticed it. My mind was racing, my heart pounding, but my face, calm. Nick had run out like a coward, and Candace had stayed behind, probably thinking I would come back, that we could talk things through. But there was nothing left to talk about. I drove. I didn't know where I was going at first, but my hands gripped the wheel, and before I knew it, I had stopped at a hotel. I checked in, took a shower, and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my phone. It buzzed. Candace, 10 missed calls. Nick, 3 messages. I didn't open them. Instead, I leaned back, closed my eyes, and let the storm inside me settle. Because tomorrow, I would make them regret everything. I had built my career on strategy and patience. My private security firm wasn't just about protecting the rich. I specialized in investigating threats before they became problems. And now, Nick and Candace were my biggest threats. I made a call to a contact in finance. Nick had always relied on me for money, for business deals, for connections. He thought being my brother meant he had a safety net. He was about to learn how wrong he was. By noon, I had started the process to remove him from every contract, every deal, and every investment he had used my name for. Giih Morato was about to become financially invisible. And Candace? She was about to lose everything she loved. Candace thought she was untouchable. She had lived in that house, spent my money, raised our kids while playing the perfect wife, all while betraying me. What she forgot, that house was mine. By the afternoon, I had called my lawyer. The house had always been under my name, and with a few quick legal maneuvers, I ensured that Candace would have exactly 1 week to leave. By evening, she called. I picked up. Jason, what's happening? The bank just called me. I cut her off. You have 7 days. 7 days for what? She asked, her voice shaking. To get out of my house? Silence. Then a desperate, broken whisper. Jason, you don't mean that. I smiled. Watch me. Nick had always been the kind of guy who talked his way out of everything. But money? Money doesn't care about smooth talk. That afternoon, Nick walked into his office like he always did, expecting everything to be fine. Instead, he found his bank accounts frozen. Every single one. His assistant looked at him, panicked. Sir, the funds are gone. Every investor has pulled out. Nick's face turned pale. He grabbed his phone, dialing my number. I let it ring. Once. Twice. 3 times. Then I picked up. Jason, bro, listen, I don't know what's happening, but we need to talk. I laughed. You think this is bad? I said. You have no idea what's coming next. Then I hung up. And Nick finally understood. He had made the worst mistake of his life. When Candace married me, she thought she had secured her future. A rich, successful husband, a beautiful home, stability. Now, she had 1 week left before she was homeless. I came by the house that evening. The moment she saw me, she ran up, her face pale, her eyes filled with tears. Jason, please. You can't do this. I walked past her, stepping inside. The house was filled with memories. Our kids' drawings on the fridge. The family portraits on the wall. The furniture she had picked out. None of it felt like home anymore. I turned to her. You should start packing. Tears spilled down her face. Jason, what about the kids? I smiled. The kids stay with me. Her breath hitched. No, you can't. I held up a folder. Full custody. Already filed. She reached for the papers, her hands shaking. She scanned through them, her face crumbling with every word. I'm not leaving, she whispered. I nodded. Then I'll let the sheriff escort you out. Candace collapsed onto the couch, sobbing. And for the first time since I caught them together, I felt nothing. Nick didn't just lose his money. He lost his career, his reputation, his place in the world. By the end of the week, his business partners had cut ties. His investors had vanished. And then came the final blow. I made one last call to the company that had hired him as a consultant. By morning, he was fired. No money, no job, no way out. And the best part? He knew exactly who did it. 7 days later, I came back to the house one last time. Candace stood at the door, her bags packed. Her face was puffy from crying, her hands trembling. She opened her mouth to speak, but I held up a hand. You don't get to talk. Her lips trembled. Where do I go? I shrugged. Not my problem. She looked at me, her eyes pleading. And for a second I saw it. The regret. The pain. The realization that she had lost everything. But it was too late. I shut the door in her face. And as I walked through my house, through the ruins of the life I once had, I took a deep breath. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. Giih Morato was not used to losing. For years, he had coasted through life on his charm, his connections, and most of all, my name. He was the reckless younger brother, the one who partied too hard, spent too much, and always knew that I would be there to bail him out. Not this time. By the time I had stripped him of every financial connection, every business deal, every safety net, he had nothing left. Desperate, he tried to reach out to old friends, business partners, anyone who could throw him a lifeline. One by one, they turned him down, and when he finally swallowed his pride and called me, I let the phone ring. I let him feel the weight of his own choices. Then, just as the last ring echoed in my ears, I declined the call. Because Giih Morato was dead to me. Candace had always been a master manipulator. She had a way of twisting words, making herself look like the victim. So it wasn't surprising when, just days after being kicked out of my house, she showed up at my office in tears. She walked in like she still had a place in my life, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "Jason," she whispered, standing in my doorway. "Please just talk to me." I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed. "What do you want, Candace?" She took a deep breath. "I know I made a mistake. I know I hurt you. But don't you think, after everything, we should at least try to fix this?" I stared at her for a long moment, letting the silence stretch. Then I chuckled. "Fix what, Candace?" Her face twisted with hope. "Our marriage. Our family." That's when I laughed. A cold, guttural laugh. "Our marriage died the night you crawled into bed with my brother," I said. "And as for family, the only thing we shared was a last name. And guess what?" I reached into my desk, pulled out a thick envelope, and tossed it onto the table. "That's your divorce agreement." Her breath hitched. "Jason, please." I cut her off. "You can sign it now, or you can fight it in court and walk away with even less. Your choice." Tears filled her eyes, and for the first time in her life, she had no power left over me. Giih had spent years writing off my success. He had never known true failure. Until now, I made sure that every financial door slammed shut in his face. His apartment? Evicted. His bank accounts? Frozen. His business connections? Gone. And when I heard that he was sleeping in his car, trying to scrape together enough money to pay his debts, I didn't feel an ounce of sympathy, because he had made his bed, and now he could lie in it. Candace thought she still had one last move to play. A week after receiving the divorce papers, she sent me a message. "Can we meet? Just to talk." I didn't respond. Then another. "Jason, I'm sorry. Please, just one conversation." Nothing. And finally one more. "I made a mistake. Please don't shut me out forever." That one? That one made me smile. Because shutting her out forever was exactly what I planned to do. The moment Candace realized I had moved on, it destroyed her. She saw me at a charity gala, standing beside a stunning woman named Evelyn. Evelyn was everything Candace wasn't. Elegant, strong, loyal. Candace watched from across the room, eyes wide with jealousy, her fingers tightening around her wine glass. For the first time, she knew what it felt like to be replaced. And when she tried to come over and speak to me, I didn't even acknowledge her. I walked away, my arm wrapped around Evelyn's waist. And Candace? She was left standing alone. Giih had lost everything. He was broke, humiliated, and desperate. So he tried one last pathetic move. He showed up at my office, unshaven, eyes sunken, looking like a ghost of the man he once was. "Jason," he started, voice cracking with desperation. "I need help, man. Just a loan. Just enough to get back on my feet." I leaned back, studying him. Then I smiled. Why would I help the man who stabbed me in the back? His lips trembled. "We're brothers." I shook my head. "No, Giih. We were brothers." Past tense. He swallowed hard, his face full of regret. "Please," he whispered. For the first time in his life, Giih Morato begged. And I turned my back on him, because he had never been my brother. Candace had spent weeks trying to hold on to what little dignity she had left. But when she heard the news, that I was officially engaged to Evelyn, something inside her finally snapped. She showed up at my house one last time. She knocked. I didn't answer. She knocked again. Harder. Still nothing. And that's when she realized she didn't belong here anymore. She turned away, tears spilling down her face, because she had lost me forever. Months later, I sat on my balcony, staring out at the skyline. Beside me, Evelyn laughed, her hand resting over mine. I had built an empire. I had found love again. And Giih and Candace? They had faded into nothing. I had erased them completely. And the best part? I didn't even hate them anymore, because I didn't think about them at all. Time has a way of burying people who once thought they were untouchable. Nick and Candace had been the center of my world once, but now they were just dust in the wind, forgotten by everyone who once cared about them. Nick had been kicked out of every business circle, blacklisted from the industry. No one wanted to touch him, not after the disaster he had become. Candace had tried to cling to old friends, but they had distanced themselves, not wanting to be associated with a woman whose entire life had fallen apart. And me? I was happier than ever. While they struggled, I thrived. While they begged, I built. They had once thought they could replace me. Now, they would give anything just to be in my world again. But that door? It was locked forever. Candace had always been the kind of woman who landed on her feet. She believed she could start over, find another rich man, secure another future. But what she didn't realize, her reputation followed her everywhere. Men saw her name and knew her story. They knew she was the woman who had cheated on her husband with his own brother. She went on a few dates, but they never led anywhere. The moment men learned who she was, they disappeared. She wasn't wife material anymore. She was a cautionary tale. And for the first time, she realized what it felt like to be the one discarded. Desperation turns men into fools. Nick had run out of options, but he refused to believe that he had lost forever. So he tried one last pathetic scheme. He borrowed money from dangerous people, promising them he had a new business venture coming. But it was a lie. And when those people came to collect, Nick had nothing to give. So they took something else. A broken nose, a few cracked ribs, and the final, humiliating realization that no one would ever save him again. Fate is cruel. One evening, Candace was working as a cashier at a department store, a far cry from the luxurious life she once had. She was scanning items when she looked up and saw me and Evelyn standing in her line. She froze. Evelyn leaned in, whispering something in my ear, making me laugh. It was a simple, casual moment, but it destroyed Candace, because for the first time, she saw me as a man who had completely moved on. She wasn't even a memory to me anymore, just a stranger. And that was the real punishment. Months passed. Then, one day, I got a text message. It was from Nick. "Jason, I know I don't deserve your help, but I have nowhere else to turn. Just give me one chance to fix this." I stared at the message for a moment. Then, I blocked his number. No response. No second chances. Because Nick Monroe was already dead to me. Candace finally accepted that no one was coming to save her. She moved into a tiny, rundown apartment in the worst part of town. She got 2 jobs, working long hours, barely making enough to survive. For the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to be powerless. She had been the one to ruin her own life. And now, she had to live with that regret every single day. Nick was out of money, options, and allies. So he did something stupid. He tried to hack into one of my business accounts. Of course, he failed. But that was the final straw. I made one last call, and by the end of the week, Nick Monroe was arrested for fraud. His story ended in a prison cell. And the brother I once had was officially gone. Years passed. One day, I was walking through the city when I spotted a woman sitting alone on a park bench. Thin, tired, hollow. It was Candace. She saw me too. For a second, I saw something in her eyes. Hope. As if she thought I might say something, acknowledge her, maybe even forgive her. Instead, I walked right past her, without a single glance. And that was the final nail in her coffin. The day I married Evelyn was the happiest day of my life. The past didn't exist anymore. Nick, gone. Candace, irrelevant. I stood at the altar, looking into the eyes of a woman who truly loved me. And for the first time in years, I felt free. Revenge isn't just about watching your enemies fall. It's about never thinking about them again. Candace and Nick had once been everything to me. Now, they were nothing. I had erased them from my life. And that was the ultimate victory. As time passed, my life continued to flourish. The empire I had built with my own hands expanded globally, and my security firm was now one of the most sought after in the industry. With Evelyn by my side, my days were filled with laughter, success, and peace, something I never had with Candace. And the best part? Neither Candace nor Nick were a part of it. While I thrived, they faded into nothingness. They had once believed they could live without me. Now, they were nothing more than ghosts of my past. Giih Morato was now just another inmate. The trial had been quick. The fraud, the financial crimes, they all caught up with him. He had tried to convince the judge that he had been set up, that he was just a victim of bad luck. But the court didn't care, and neither did I. The moment the judge announced his 5-year sentence, Giih finally realized he had destroyed himself. And me? I didn't even attend the trial, because Giih Morato was already dead to me. Candace had held on to one last illusion, that one day I would forgive her. She had convinced herself that I still thought about her, that I still had feelings buried deep inside. But one night, she saw something that shattered that illusion completely. A newspaper headline: Giih Morato and Evelyn Carter announce expecting their first child. Candace stared at the words, her hands shaking. She had given me 10 years of her life, and now another woman was giving me the future she had thrown away. And for the first time, Candace finally understood. She had lost me forever. From prison, Giih wrote me a letter. I didn't expect it. I didn't want it. But it arrived anyway. The words were pathetic. Jason, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But if there's even the smallest part of you that still remembers the brother we used to be, please don't let me rot in here. I folded the letter. I let the silence settle. Then, I threw it in the trash. Giih had made his choices. Now, he could live with them. Candace had nothing left. She had spent months jumping from one job to another, barely making enough to survive. One night, after another failed job interview, she broke down. She pulled out her phone, scrolled through old pictures. Our wedding, our kids, our vacations. Then, with trembling hands, she called my number. For the first time in years, she heard my voicemail. But she didn't get to leave a message. Because halfway through, she realized my number had been disconnected. She had no way to reach me. I had erased her completely. One last time, Candace tried to rebuild her life. She moved to a new city, changed her name, tried to become someone new. But the past has a way of catching up, and no matter where she went, people knew. They knew about the affair, the betrayal, the man she had thrown away. And no one wanted a woman like that. Years had passed. My son, Nathan, was now a teenager. One day, while we sat in my office, he looked at me and asked, "Dad, do you ever think about Mom?" I paused. Then I smiled. "No, son," I said simply. "I don't," because I had moved on. And Candace? She was nothing more than a forgotten mistake. Candace sat alone in a cheap diner, eating a meal she could barely afford. Across the room, she heard 2 women whispering. "I heard he's a billionaire now." "Yeah, and he just had his 3rd kid with that Evelyn woman. He's so happy." Candace's fingers tightened around her fork. She didn't have to ask who they were talking about. She knew, and in that moment, she felt the full weight of what she had lost. Candace applied for a corporate assistant job, desperate to rebuild herself. She walked into the office, dressed in her best outfit, rehearsing what she would say. Then the door opened, and sitting behind the desk was Evelyn. Candace's entire body went cold. Evelyn smiled. "Sorry, Candace," she said, her voice smooth and powerful. "But we don't hire women like you." Candace's world shattered. Because now, even my wife had more power than her. One day, I was walking through the city with my daughter, and I saw her. Candace. She was sitting on a park bench, looking old, tired, completely defeated. She saw me too. For a second, I saw something in her eyes. Hope. As if she thought I might stop, might speak to her, might acknowledge her existence. Instead, I walked right past her, without a single glance. Because Giih Morato was already dead to me. Giih had been released from prison, but he had nowhere to go. One night, I got a text message. "Jason, please. I have nothing. Just say something." I stared at it for a moment. Then, I deleted it. Because Giih, he was nothing. I sat at the head of my dining table, my children laughing, Evelyn smiling at me. This was the family I was supposed to have. No betrayal. No lies. No regrets. Just peace. And Giih and Candace? They didn't exist anymore. Years had passed since the storm of betrayal had wrecked my life. What once felt like an unbearable tragedy had become nothing more than a distant memory, a lesson in survival, and a testament to my strength. My name, Giih Morato, was no longer just a name. It had become a symbol of power, resilience, and success. The security firm I built had expanded into an international empire, securing contracts with government agencies, billion-dollar corporations, and elite clients who valued my expertise. What started as a company designed to protect others from threats had now turned into an untouchable force in the industry. And me? I had everything I ever wanted. A strong, beautiful, loyal wife. 3 incredible children who looked up to me. A life that was calm, controlled, and completely free of the ghosts from my past. I often wondered if Nick and Candace ever saw the world I had built, if they silently watched from the shadows, knowing they had been replaced, forgotten, erased. If they did, it must have destroyed them, because now, they were nothing. Nick had once been the golden boy, the charming talker who could walk into any room and get what he wanted. But after prison, financial ruin, and complete social rejection, he had become a ghost of his former self. No one wanted to do business with him. No one trusted him. The Monroe name, which once opened doors for him, was now a curse that got him shut out of every opportunity. He tried moving to a new city, thinking a fresh start could change his luck. But what he didn't understand was, your past always follows you. His criminal record, his history of fraud, his reputation as the brother who betrayed the wrong man. They all ensured that no matter where he went, people knew exactly who he was. And who he was a failure. The last I ever heard of him, he was working as a low-level security guard in a shopping mall, living in a one-bedroom apartment with nothing to his name. It was poetic, really, because the man who had once mocked my success, who thought he could steal from me and walk away untouched, had been reduced to nothing. And me? I didn't even need to lift a finger. He destroyed himself. Candace was once the love of my life. She was the woman I built a future with, the mother of my children, the person I thought would stand by my side through everything. And she had thrown it all away for a temporary thrill, a fleeting passion that had burned out faster than she ever expected. After our divorce, she had tried to find another man to replace me, to secure herself in another wealthy life. But there was one problem. No man wanted to be with a woman whose entire reputation was built on betrayal. Every man she met knew her as the ex-wife who cheated on Jason Monroe. And the worst part? They all respected me. So one by one, they walked away, leaving her alone in the world she had ruined for herself. With no career, no financial security, and no one to lean on, she ended up working small jobs, struggling to pay rent in a neighborhood far from the luxury she once flaunted. One night, she must have had one last hope, one last desperate attempt to feel like she still mattered. Because she sent me a message. Jason, do you ever think about me? I stared at the words for exactly 5 seconds. Then, I deleted the message without responding. Because Candace Monroe no longer existed. Not in my world. Not in my mind. Not anywhere that mattered. One evening, as I was tucking my son Lucas in a bed, he looked up at me with curious eyes. Dad, he asked, what happened to Uncle Nick? I paused for a second, not out of hesitation, but because I realized how little I had thought about him. Nick Monroe had once been my greatest enemy, the man who had betrayed me in the worst way possible. Now, he was just someone I used to know. I smiled at my son, ruffled his hair, and said, he made some bad choices, son. And bad choices have consequences. Lucas nodded, accepting the answer without further questions. Because in this house, Nick Monroe's name was never spoken again. People often think revenge is about ruining the ones who hurt you. But I had learned something far greater. True revenge is when their existence no longer affects you. While Candace and Nick struggled to survive, I was traveling the world with my family, running a billion-dollar business, waking up every morning to a life I built without them. I didn't need to watch them suffer. I didn't even need to know if they were suffering, because they weren't even a part of my thoughts anymore. That was true victory. Fate is cruel sometimes. One evening, years later, I was at a charity gala with Evelyn, shaking hands with the city's wealthiest and most powerful people. And that's when I saw her. Candace. She wasn't at the event. She was outside the venue, standing behind the security gates, watching from a distance. She looked tired, empty, a shell of the woman I once knew. For a brief second, her eyes met mine, and in that moment I saw it. The regret, the pain, the realization that she had lost something she could never get back. I turned away without a word, because the past didn't matter anymore. At the height of my success, I stood in my office, looking at the city skyline. My company was worth billions. My children were growing into strong, intelligent leaders. My wife was the greatest love I had ever known. And the people who had tried to destroy me, they had destroyed themselves instead. Nick and Candace had once been everything in my life. Now, they weren't even a footnote in my story. One evening, I sat with Evelyn on our balcony, watching the sun set. She smiled at me, resting her head on my shoulder. "Do you ever think about them?" she asked softly. I knew what she meant. Nick, Candace, the people who had once tried to break me. I took a deep breath, exhaled slowly, and smiled. "No," I said simply. "Not at all." And in that moment I knew I had won, because the best revenge is moving on so completely that they no longer exist in your world. The soft melody of a violin wafted through the dimly lit Italian restaurant, mingling with the faint clinking of glasses and hushed murmurs of other diners. Jake absent-mindedly traced the edge of his wine glass, his eyes on Lily, who sat across the table, unusually quiet. For as long as he could remember, this had been their spot, a place of solace, where they could reconnect amidst the chaos of life. But tonight something was off. Lily's eyes darted nervously around the room, her fingers fidgeting with the corner of her napkin. The smile that usually lit up her face seemed forced, the light in her gaze replaced with a flicker of hesitation. Jake's stomach churned. He knew her well enough to sense when she was holding back, but nothing could have prepared him for what came next. "I've been thinking," Lily began, her voice forcibly casual, though her hands betrayed her nerves as they twisted the silver ring she always wore. Jake leaned forward, his brow furrowing. "About what?" Lily hesitated, taking a deep breath as if gathering courage. Then, with the same nonchalance one might use to suggest a change in dinner plans, she said, "Maybe we should allow each other a free pass. Just one night to explore." The words hit Jake like a freight train. For a moment, he thought he'd misheard. He blinked at her, waiting for a smile or a laugh, something to indicate this was a joke. But Lily's expression remained serious, a flicker of excitement in her eyes as she gauged his reaction. "A free pass," he repeated, his voice low and steady, masking the storm of emotions raging inside him. "Yes," she said quickly, as if relieved the words were finally out. Just once, to see if we're missing out on anything. It's not about us, Jake. It's just curiosity." Jake's grip on his wine glass tightened, the cool surface pressing against his palm. The idea of Lily, his Lily, being with someone else was unfathomable. And the casual way she suggested it, as if it were no more consequential than trying a new hobby, left him speechless. "You mean," he began carefully, "you want to sleep with someone else?" "Not permanently," Lily clarified, her tone light. "Just once, to spice things up." Spice things up. The phrase twisted in Jake's mind like a knife. He'd spent years building a life with her, pouring his heart and soul into their relationship. And now, she wanted to throw it all away for a fleeting thrill. He forced himself to smile, though it felt more like a grimace. "If that's what you want, Lily, we'll talk about it later." Her face lit up with relief, mistaking his composure for agreement. "I think it'll be good for us," she said, her tone brightening. Jake barely registered her words. He was too busy battling the tidal wave of anger, betrayal, and heartbreak threatening to consume him. For the rest of the meal, he maintained a facade of calm, responding to her chatter with nods and polite murmurs. But inside, he was unraveling. The ride home from the restaurant was a strained silence, broken only by the faint hum of the engine. Jake's hands gripped the steering wheel, so tightly his knuckles turned white, but his face betrayed none of the turmoil within. Lily hummed softly beside him, as though the evening had been a success. She didn't seem to notice the storm brewing in the man she called her husband. Jake glanced at her out of the corner of his eye. How could she sit there so calmly, so carelessly, after what she had just suggested? As they pulled into their driveway, Jake killed the engine but made no move to get out. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. He had to stay calm, had to think clearly, Acting in anger would give her the upper hand, and he wouldn't let that happen. You coming? Lily asked brightly as she stepped out of the car. Jake nodded silently, following her inside. The house felt colder than usual, the familiar warmth replaced by an oppressive heaviness. He watched Lily kick off her heels and head to the kitchen, her carefree demeanor like salt in an open wound. I'm going to bed, he muttered, his voice devoid of emotion. Lily paused, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. You okay? Jake forced a smile. Just tired. Long day. She hesitated, then shrugged. All right. I'll be up soon. Jake lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The weight of her words pressed down on him, each syllable replaying in his mind like a broken record. A free pass. How could she reduce their marriage to something so trivial? His phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Max, his oldest friend, who had always been a steady presence in his life. You good? The text read. Jake stared at the screen, his fingers hovering over the keyboard before he typed a response. Not really. Can I call? The phone rang almost immediately. What's up? Max's voice was laced with concern. Jake took a deep breath, his words spilling out in a rush. He recounted everything. The dinner, Lily's suggestion, the hollow way she'd looked at him as if their years together meant nothing. When he finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Jake, Max finally said, his tone firm, this isn't on you. This is about her. She's the one who's lost respect for what you've built together. But listen to me, you have to stay calm. Don't let this break you. If you want to give her that freedom, fine, but do it on your terms. Jake nodded, even though Max couldn't see him. You're right. I won't act out of anger. But I can't let this slide, either. Good? Whatever you need, I'm here. After hanging up, Jake felt a strange sense of clarity. He couldn't control Lily's actions, but he could control his response. He wasn't just going to sit back and let her walk all over him. No, he was going to show her exactly what it meant to take him for granted. The days that followed were eerily normal. Lily seemed convinced that Jake had accepted her idea, and her demeanor shifted. She was more affectionate, more attentive, as if compensating for her guilt, or perhaps celebrating her newfound freedom. Jake played along, masking his resentment with a calm, detached demeanor. He watched her closely, analyzing every word, every movement. She was hiding something. He could feel it. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching a movie, Jake decided to test the waters. So, he said casually, have you thought about who you'd use your free pass on? Lily froze for a fraction of a second, her reaction so brief it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But Jake caught it. Her laugh was light, but it didn't reach her eyes. Of course not, Jake. It's not like I have anyone in mind. I just thought we both needed something fresh. Fresh, Jake repeated, the word bitter on his tongue. He forced a smile. Makes sense. Lily relaxed, seemingly reassured by his response. But Jake's mind was already racing. He didn't believe her for a second. Behind the scenes, he began laying the groundwork. He met with a lawyer discreetly, ensuring his assets were protected and preparing for the possibility of separation. He sorted through their financial documents, making copies of everything important. Quietly, he began moving some of his belongings to Max's apartment under the guise of spring cleaning. Every step he took was calculated, methodical. He wasn't just preparing for the fallout. He was planning his next move. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, each second dragging like an eternity. Jake sat in the living room, feigning interest in the sports channel, though his mind was elsewhere. Lily had been buzzing with excitement all day, her plans for the evening carefully disguised as a girls' night out. You don't mind, do you? She had asked earlier, her tone almost too casual. Not at all, Jake had replied, his expression unreadable. But as she descended the stairs now, dressed in a way she hadn't for him in years, Jake's stomach churned. Her fitted black dress hugged her curves, the soft scent of her perfume filling the room like an unwelcome intruder. Wow, he said, his tone neutral. You look ready for a good time. Lily smiled, her cheeks flushing slightly. Thanks. Don't wait up, okay? It might get late. Jake's jaw tightened, but he forced a small smile. Have fun. As the door closed behind her, the house fell into a heavy silence. Jake sat motionless, staring at the blank TV screen. He had expected this moment, prepared for it even, but the pain was sharper than he had anticipated. He poured himself a drink, the amber liquid swirling in the glass as he tried to steady his thoughts. Hours passed, each one heavier than the last. He imagined her out there laughing, dancing, maybe even no. He pushed the thought away, but it clung to him like a shadow. At 2 a.m., the sound of the front door opening snapped him out of his daze. He stayed seated as Lily entered, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. Her makeup was slightly smudged, her hair disheveled in a way that set Jake's teeth on edge. "Hey," she said, her voice light but tinged with an awkwardness she couldn't quite mask. Jake glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "You're back late?" "It was fun," she replied, avoiding his gaze. Just girl stuff?" Jake nodded, standing slowly. "I hope you got what you wanted out of it." Lily froze, her smile faltering. "What do you mean?" "Nothing," Jake said, brushing past her. "Good night, Lily." Her eyes lingered on him, a flicker of uncertainty in her expression. But Jake didn't look back. The next morning, the air between them was heavy. Lily seemed nervous, her cheerful facade cracking under the weight of Jake's silence. Over breakfast, he decided it was time to confront her. "So," he began, his tone deceptively light, "did you enjoy your free pass?" Lily nearly choked on her coffee. "Jake!" "No, really," he continued, leaning back in his chair. "Was it everything you hoped for?" "It wasn't like that," she stammered, her cheeks flushing. "It was just one night. It doesn't mean anything." Jake's calm exterior began to crack, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. "Doesn't mean anything? You tore apart our marriage for a cheap thrill, and you think it doesn't mean anything?" Lily's eyes widened, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to find words. I thought it could bring us closer. I didn't mean..." "You didn't mean to betray me?" Jake snapped, standing abruptly. "Because that's what you did, Lily. You took everything we built and threw it away." Her voice broke as she reached for him. "Jake, please. I was wrong. It didn't mean anything. I swear." Jake stepped back, his gaze cold. "You wanted freedom. You got it. And now, so will I." Lily's face crumpled, but Jake didn't stay to watch her tears. He walked out of the house, the door slamming behind him. Jake's withdrawal was deliberate and thorough. He packed his belongings over the next few days, moving into Max's apartment while Lily watched helplessly. Her attempts to bridge the growing chasm between them were met with icy silence. "Jake, please," she begged one evening, tears streaming down her face. "We can fix this. Just tell me how to make it right." "You can't," Jake replied flatly, not even looking at her. Lily's desperate apologies only fueled his resolve. Every tear, every plea was a reminder of how easily she had dismissed their bond for her selfish whims. Meanwhile, Jake began his subtle campaign. He contacted mutual friends, dropping vague but suggestive comments about moving forward and finding someone who valued loyalty. The rumors spread like wildfire, eventually reaching Lily. The house felt emptier with each passing day. Jake's absence was tangible, an oppressive void that seemed to grow with every box he took to Max's apartment. Lily sat alone in the living room, staring at her phone, willing him to call, text, anything. But her screen remained dark. When she ventured out to meet friends, their smiles seemed forced, their words too carefully chosen. Lily picked up on the subtle shift in their behavior, the knowing glances exchanged when she wasn't looking. Jake's quiet campaign was working. One evening, she overheard a whispered conversation at a mutual friend's party. "I heard Jake's moving on," one voice said. And honestly, who could blame him? Lily's stomach dropped. She approached the group, forcing a laugh to mask her growing panic. "What's this about Jake?" The women exchanged awkward glances before one of them spoke. "Oh, nothing serious. Just rumors." Lily's forced smile wavered. "What kind of rumors?" Her friend hesitated, then sighed. "That he's seeing someone." "Honestly, Lily, we're all surprised he lasted this long. He deserved better." The words stung more than she expected. She left the party early, her mind racing. Was it true? Was Jake really seeing someone else? The thought clawed at her, growing into a gnawing obsession. Jake watched the fallout unfold from a distance, every piece of his plan clicking into place. The whispers, the rumors, the carefully planted seeds of doubt. All of it was leading Lily exactly where he wanted her. His next move was calculated. One evening, he posted a cryptic message on social media, grateful to be moving forward with someone who values loyalty and trust. Excited for what's ahead, the post was deliberately vague, but its impact was immediate. Within minutes, his inbox was flooded with messages from friends, acquaintances, and even strangers. But the one message he was waiting for didn't come until hours later. Lily's name lit up his phone screen. He let it ring. Then it rang again and again. Finally, he picked up, his tone cool and detached. "What is it, Lily?" "Jake," she began, her voice trembling. "I saw your post. Is it true? Are you seeing someone?" Jake paused, letting the silence stretch long enough to make her squirm. "What does it matter to you?" "It matters because I still love you," she blurted out, her words spilling over each other. "I know I made a mistake, Jake. I know I hurt you. But we can fix this. Please, tell me it's not true." Jake's lips curled into a bitter smile. "You want a freedom, Lily? I'm just following your lead." Her sobs echoed through the phone, but Jake remained impassive. "Good night, Lily," he said, hanging up without another word. Lily's desperation deepened in the weeks that followed. She left tearful voicemails, poured her heart into long texts, and even showed up unannounced at Max's apartment. Jake ignored her at every turn. But he wasn't done yet. He had one last move to make, one that would ensure Lily truly understood the gravity of her actions. Jake contacted a real estate agent to list their house, the very home they had built together. It was the final symbol of their life as a couple, and dismantling it was a deliberate choice. He left the papers on the kitchen counter one evening, knowing Lily would see them when she came by to pick up her mail. The phone call came an hour later. "Jake, what is this?" she demanded, her voice thick with panic. "It's a sale agreement," Jake replied evenly. "We don't need the house anymore." "But it's our home," Lily cried. "It was," Jake said coldly. "But that ended the night you decided we needed a free pass." Jake chose the same Italian restaurant for their final confrontation, the place where it had all begun. It was poetic, in a way, to end things where the cracks in their marriage had first surfaced. When Lily arrived, she looked like a shadow of the woman she had been. Her face was pale, her eyes red and swollen from sleepless nights. She slid into the seat across from Jake, her hands trembling as she reached for the water glass. "Jake," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, don't do this. I know I messed up. I thought having that freedom would make me feel alive again. But I was wrong. I lost sight of what we had, and I'll never find it again." Jake studied her for a long moment, his face unreadable. "Lily," he said finally, "when you asked me for that free pass, you didn't just ask for one night. You took the heart of our marriage and traded it for a fleeting thrill. You betrayed everything we built together." Tears streamed down her face as she reached for his hand. "I'll do anything, Jake. Please, just give me one more chance." But Jake shook his head, his expression resolute. "You already had your chance, Lily. You wanted a free pass, and now you have it. A free pass to move on without me." He stood, leaving her sitting alone at the table, her sobs echoing in the otherwise quiet restaurant. As Jake stepped into the cool night air, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The pain of Lily's betrayal was still there, but it was no longer a burden. He had taken back control, reclaiming his dignity and his future. For the first time in weeks, Jake felt something unfamiliar yet welcome: peace. The room was warm, illuminated by the soft glow of candles flickering on the dining table. Matthew adjusted the cuffs of his tuxedo as he refilled Gwen's wine glass. This was their tradition: dressing up, staying in, and celebrating Valentine's Day as though they were dining at the finest restaurant in the city. But something felt different tonight. Gwen sat across from him in her stunning red dress, her posture poised but her expression distant. Matthew had known this woman for 22 years, and tonight, her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Happy Valentine's Day," she said, raising her glass. Her voice was steady, but lacked its usual warmth. To us, Matthew replied, forcing a smile. Yet his gut churned. Something wasn't right. They sipped their wine, exchanged pleasantries, and reminisced about past Valentine's days. But the evening had an undercurrent of tension he couldn't ignore. Matthew, Gwen said suddenly, setting her glass down. The sound of the stem hitting the table was sharper than he expected. His heart skipped a beat. She rarely called him Matthew, only when she had something serious to say. He braced himself. I've been doing a lot of thinking lately, she began, her tone measured. About us. About me. Matthew set his fork down, giving her his full attention. He felt a cold dread creeping over him, gripping his chest like a vice. Okay, he said slowly. What's on your mind? She sighed deeply, as though summoning courage. We've been married a long time, and I started wondering what it's like to explore other experiences. Matthew blinked, the words hanging in the air like a lead weight. What kind of experiences? He asked, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. Gwen met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. I want to make our marriage open. I want to be with other men. The room seemed to tilt. For a moment, Matthew wasn't sure if he'd heard her correctly. The woman he'd loved and cherished for over 2 decades, the mother of his children, had just dropped a bombshell he couldn't fathom. An open marriage, he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, Gwen said, her tone disturbingly calm. It's something I need to do for myself. Matthew sat back in his chair, his mind racing. Every fiber of his being screamed to lash out, to demand answers, to beg her to take it back. But he knew better. And what about me? He asked, his voice low and controlled. Do I get to explore too? No, Gwen said quickly, her tone firm. This isn't about you. It's about me. Matthew let out a bitter laugh. So let me get this straight. You want to sleep with other men, but I'm supposed to sit here and... What? Wait for you to come home? Be a supportive husband while you... Explore? Gwen frowned, her confidence faltering for the first time. Matthew, it's not like that. I love you. I just need this freedom to figure out who I am. He stared at her, his chest tightening with anger and disbelief. And who do you have in mind for this freedom? Someone at work, perhaps? Her face paled, her composure cracking. She looked away, unable to meet his gaze. Matthew's heart sank. He'd been right. This wasn't just a hypothetical idea. She already had someone. Mark Taylor, he said, the name rolling off his tongue like venom. Gwen's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. What? How do you? Don't insult my intelligence, Matthew snapped, his voice rising. You think I haven't noticed? The late nights, the sudden business trips, the way you've been dressing differently? You've already opened this marriage, haven't you? Gwen's lips parted, but no words came out. The guilt on her face said everything he needed to know. Matthew stood, pacing the room as Gwen watched him nervously. He pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed a number. Hello, Clarissa, he said, his voice steady. It's Matthew. I think it's time we move forward with the plan. Gwen's eyes widened in horror. Clarissa? Mark's wife? What? What have you done? Matthew turned to her, his gaze cold and unyielding. You think I didn't know? You think I'd let you humiliate me without a fight? Gwen stammered, her composure crumbling. Matthew, please. I can explain. Save it, he said sharply. You've already lost everything, Gwen. And now, you're going to face the consequences. Gwen sat frozen, her face a mask of shock and panic. For years, she had meticulously crafted an image of a perfect marriage, a devoted wife and mother who managed to balance work and home life seamlessly. But now, that carefully constructed facade was crumbling before her eyes. Clarissa and I have been talking, Matthew said, his tone calm yet menacing. He leaned against the edge of the dining table, his arms crossed. She's been just as much in the dark as I was. Until recently. I can explain, Gwen stammered, her voice trembling. It wasn't like that. Don't insult me by lying, Matthew interrupted sharply, his eyes narrowing. You think I don't know about the texts? The hotel rendezvous? Or the fact that you spent my birthday with him? His voice cracked, and for the briefest moment his composure wavered. But he quickly regained control, standing tall. You didn't just betray me, Gwen. You disrespected me. You disrespected our family. The first crack in Matthew's trust came months ago. Gwen had been acting differently, leaving early for work, coming home late, and suddenly taking a newfound interest in her appearance. At first, Matthew brushed it off as a midlife change. After all, they'd been together for over 2 decades. People evolve. But then, one evening, he noticed a text pop up on her phone while she was in the shower. The message read, "Can't wait to see you again. Last night was incredible. XO Mark." His heart sank. He felt like the ground beneath him had vanished, leaving him in a free fall. But he didn't confront her. Not immediately. Instead, he began to dig. He accessed her phone while she slept, scrolling through her messages with Mark. What he found confirmed his worst fears. The texts were explicit, filled with passion and longing that she hadn't expressed toward him in years. Matthew felt a mix of rage and devastation, but he kept it bottled up. If he was going to confront her, he needed more than texts. He needed undeniable proof. The next morning, Matthew hired a private investigator. Over the course of several weeks, the PI gathered damning evidence. Photos of Gwen and Mark holding hands at a cafe, stolen kisses in parking lots, and finally, the two of them entering a hotel together. When the PI handed over the file, Matthew felt a strange sense of clarity. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt. It was the sheer audacity. Gwen had taken their marriage, their family, and his trust, and discarded it as if it were nothing. Reaching out to Clarissa had been a gamble, but it paid off. When Matthew contacted her, she was initially skeptical, but after sharing the evidence, her disbelief turned to fury. Mark had been her husband for 15 years, and she had suspected nothing. "We need to confront them together," Clarissa had said, her voice trembling with anger. "They think they're so clever sneaking around behind our backs, but they don't realize how foolish they've been." Together, Matthew and Clarissa crafted a plan to expose Gwen and Mark. The Valentine's Day dinner was the perfect opportunity. "I loved you, Gwen," Matthew said, his voice breaking. "I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me?" Tears streamed down Gwen's face, but Matthew felt no sympathy. "Not anymore. I didn't mean for it to happen," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I was lonely. You were always so busy with work, and Mark, he made me feel special. Don't you dare blame me for this," Matthew snapped. "Do you think I worked long hours for fun? I was providing for this family, for you. Everything I did was for us." "I'm sorry," Gwen sobbed. "Please, Matthew, we can fix this." He shook his head. "You didn't just cheat on me, Gwen. You betrayed our children, our life together. And the worst part? You didn't even have the decency to come clean. You wanted to turn me into a fool, asking for an open marriage after you'd already been unfaithful." Matthew picked up the envelope from the table and handed it to Gwen. "What's this?" she asked, her hands trembling as she took it. "Divorce papers," he said flatly. "I want you out of this house by the end of the week. We'll arrange custody for Jake, but I will not tolerate you bringing Mark anywhere near him." Gwen's face crumpled. "No, please, Matthew. Don't do this. I'll end it with Mark. I'll do anything to make this right." "You already made your choices," Matthew replied coldly. "Now you'll live with the consequences." Meanwhile, across town, Clarissa was delivering her own brand of justice. Mark had returned home to find his bags packed and a restraining order on the kitchen counter. Clarissa's fury was palpable, and she made it clear that their marriage was over. "You thought you could play both sides," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "But you underestimated me. You're going to regret this, Mark." As Gwen tried to plead her case, Matthew delivered the final blow. He played a recording of her and Mark's explicit phone conversations, captured by the PI. Her face turned white as the damning words filled the room. "You thought I didn't know," Matthew said, his voice icy. "You thought I was oblivious. But I've been one step ahead of you this entire time." Gwen collapsed into a chair, her body racked with sobs. For the first time, she realized the full extent of what she had lost. Gwen's sobs echoed through the dining room, but Matthew stood unmoved, watching her with a detached, almost clinical gaze. The papers in front of her were unambiguous: a legal separation, division of assets, and arrangements for custody of their son, Jake. Her mind reeled as she tried to process the gravity of what had just happened. Mark hadn't prepared her for this. In fact, Mark had always dismissed the possibility of discovery, assuring her that everything was under control. But it wasn't. Now, the walls of her carefully constructed life were collapsing around her, and she could feel herself suffocating under the weight of her choices. The last time Gwen had seen Mark was just 2 days earlier. They had met for lunch at a cozy cafe near her office, a routine they had established under the guise of business meetings. "I've been thinking," Gwen had said, stirring her coffee absently. "Maybe we should tell Matthew and Clarissa. You know about us?" Mark had chuckled, shaking his head. "Gwen, trust me, that's a terrible idea. Why complicate things? We have a good thing going here. Why risk it?" "But I hate the secrecy," she had protested. "I want to be with you openly. Isn't that what you want too?" Mark had leaned back, giving her a reassuring smile. "Of course I do. But let's not rush. We have time." Gwen had believed him then, but now, sitting across from Matthew, she realized the truth. Mark never intended to leave Clarissa. He had been stringing her along, using her as a distraction from his own unhappy marriage. Later that evening, Gwen tried calling Charlotte again. Her daughter's voicemail greeted her each time, and the messages Gwen left became increasingly desperate. "Sweetheart, it's Mom. Please call me back. I need to explain. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Charlotte had always been close to Matthew, admiring his unwavering dedication to their family. Gwen's betrayal had shattered that bond, and now she faced the heartbreaking reality that her daughter wanted nothing to do with her. While Gwen spiraled into despair, Matthew found solace in small victories. The day after the confrontation, he met with Clarissa to finalize their plans for the divorce proceedings. Sitting across from her in a quiet coffee shop, he felt an unexpected camaraderie with the woman who had been just as blindsided by betrayal as he had. "I'm done feeling like a victim," Clarissa said, sipping her tea. "Mark doesn't get to control my life anymore. And neither does your wife." Matthew nodded, her determination sparking something inside him. "I've spent so long trying to hold everything together. Maybe it's time to let go." "That's the first step," Clarissa said with a small smile. Matthew threw himself into rebuilding his life. He reconnected with old friends, started running again, a hobby he had abandoned years ago, and even took Jake on a weekend camping trip to Bond. Jake had been quiet since learning about the divorce, but during the trip, he finally opened up. "Dad," he said one evening as they sat by the fire, "I don't get it. Why did Mom do it?" Matthew took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes people make choices that hurt the ones they love. It doesn't mean they don't care, but it does mean they weren't thinking about what's best for everyone. Are we going to be okay?" Jake asked, his voice small. Matthew pulled him into a hug. "We're going to be more than okay, buddy. I promise." Days turned into weeks, and Gwen found herself increasingly isolated. Jake refused to speak to her, choosing to stay with Matthew whenever possible. Her parents, once her pillars of support, were distant, their disappointment evident in every strained phone call. One evening, Gwen showed up unannounced at Matthew's doorstep. She looked pale and disheveled, a shadow of the confident woman she once was. "Matthew, please," she said, her voice trembling. "I need to talk to you." He hesitated but eventually stepped aside, allowing her in. "I've lost everything," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Charlotte won't talk to me. Jake hates me. Even my own parents are ashamed of me. I don't know what to do." Matthew crossed his arms, leaning against the kitchen counter. "What did you expect, Gwen? That there wouldn't be consequences?" "I made a mistake," she sobbed. "A terrible mistake. But I still love you. I know I hurt you. But can't we fix this? For the kids?" Matthew's expression hardened. "You didn't just make a mistake, Gwen. You made a series of choices. You lied, you cheated, and then you tried to manipulate me into accepting it. There's no coming back from that." Gwen's plea for forgiveness turned into anger. "You're no saint, Matthew. You worked late every night. You were so focused on your career that you barely noticed me. And that justifies what you did." Matthew shot back, his voice rising. "I was working for us, for this family. Meanwhile, You were off playing house with another man. I was lonely, she shouted, her voice cracking. Matthew shook his head, his anger giving way to pity. You weren't lonely, Gwen. You were selfish. And now, you're paying the price for it. Gwen eventually left, her pleas unanswered. As the door closed behind her, Matthew felt a strange sense of peace. He had been through hell, but now he was free. In the weeks that followed, he finalized the divorce, ensuring that Gwen had no claim to the house or the majority of their savings. Clarissa had done the same with Mark, and the two of them stayed in touch, supporting each other as they navigated their new lives. For the first time in years, Matthew felt a glimmer of hope. His family had been fractured, but he was determined to build something stronger from the pieces. And as he watched Jake laugh around the dinner table one evening, Matthew knew he had made the right choice. As weeks turned into months, Gwen's world became a desolate landscape of regret and shame. She moved out of the family home and into a modest apartment on the edge of town, a far cry from the warm, bustling house she once shared with her family. The silence in her new home was deafening. Every room echoed with reminders of what she had lost. The picture frames she had brought with her felt like mockery, their smiling faces frozen in a time when her family was whole. Her attempts to reach out to her children were met with resistance. Charlotte refused to answer her calls, and Jake only spoke to her when absolutely necessary, his words clipped and cold. Even her parents, Jill and Robert, kept their distance. Their disappointment weighed heavily on her, made worse by Jill's scathing words the last time they spoke. We didn't raise you to be this person, Gwen. You've embarrassed yourself, your family, and us. Gwen had clung to the hope that Mark would be her salvation, that their connection was worth the price she had paid. But Mark, too, had disappeared. After Clarissa confronted him and served him divorce papers, he severed all contact with Gwen. One evening, she worked up the nerve to call him, her hands shaking as she dialed his number. "Mark, it's me," she said when he answered. There was a long pause before he replied, his voice terse. "Gwen, this isn't a good time. I need to talk to you," she pleaded. "I don't know what to do. Everything's falling apart." Mark sighed heavily. "Look, Gwen, I'm trying to fix things with Clarissa. She's willing to work things out, but only if I cut all ties with you." "What?" Gwen's voice cracked. "But you said—" "I know what I said," Mark interrupted, his tone impatient. "But things have changed. I can't risk losing my kids over this. I'm sorry, Gwen, but it's over." The line went dead, and Gwen stared at her phone in disbelief. Mark had used her, discarded her, and now he was crawling back to his wife in an attempt to salvage what he could. While Gwen's life spiraled downward, Matthew's began to flourish. His focus shifted from merely surviving the ordeal to thriving in its aftermath. He joined a local running group, where he found both companionship and a sense of purpose. He also began attending therapy, something Clarissa had recommended during one of their many late-night conversations. "You've been through a lot," she had told him. "Talking to someone might help." At first, he was hesitant, but the sessions proved invaluable. Through therapy, he gained clarity, recognizing that Gwen's betrayal was not a reflection of his worth, but of her own insecurities and selfishness. One evening, while attending a community event with Jake, Matthew struck up a conversation with a woman named Emma. She was a single mother, vibrant and full of life, with an infectious laugh that caught him off guard. They exchanged numbers, and over the weeks that followed, their connection deepened. Matthew took things slow, unsure if he was ready for a new relationship. But Emma's kindness and understanding made it easy to let his guard down. On their third date, as they walked through a park lit by soft lanterns, Emma stopped and looked at him with a gentle smile. "You're a good man, Matthew," she said. "Anyone can see that." For the first time in years, Matthew felt seen, not as a provider or a father or a victim of betrayal, but as himself. One rainy afternoon, Gwen showed up at the family home unannounced. She stood on the porch, drenched and trembling, her eyes hollow. Matthew opened the door, his expression unreadable. "Matthew, please," she began, her voice barely audible. "I know I don't deserve it, but can we talk?" He stepped aside, letting her in. The warmth of the house contrasted sharply with the cold rain outside, and Gwen felt a pang of longing as she looked around at the familiar space. "I made a mistake," she said, her voice breaking. "I let my selfishness destroy everything. But I still love you, Matthew. I always have. Can we try again? For the kids?" Matthew studied her for a long moment before speaking. "Do you remember what you told me that night?" Gwen frowned, confused. "You said it wasn't about us. It was about you," he continued, his tone calm but firm. "And you were right. It was never about us. It was about your choices, your lies, your betrayal." Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "I'm sorry. I've already forgiven you," Matthew said, surprising her. "Not for your sake, but for mine. Holding on to that anger was only hurting me. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean we can go back to the way things were." He stepped back, gesturing toward the door. "Goodbye, Gwen." As Gwen walked away from the house, her shoulders hunched against the rain. She realized that the life she had destroyed could never be rebuilt. For Matthew, the encounter was a turning point, a final chapter closed. He returned to the living room, where Jake was working on a school project, and sat down beside him. "You okay, Dad?" Jake asked, looking up from his notebook. Matthew smiled, ruffling his son's hair. "Yeah, buddy, I'm okay." In that moment, surrounded by the quiet warmth of home, Matthew knew that he and his children would be more than okay. They were building something new, something stronger. And for the first time in a long time, Matthew felt free.